You brought justice on yourself. Please stop. This is what you deserve.
She stood there, drenched and shivering in the pouring rain, watching her stepmother slam the mansion door in her face, completely unaware that she actually owned every single brick of that $500 billion empire. But when her stepsister dumped a bucket of filthy water over her head, laughing as she stood there, humiliated beside the beggar she'd just helped, that poor old man slowly reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a sealed envelope, and what he revealed in the next 60 seconds didn't just destroy her stepmother's smug smile. It left them both bankrupt and begging on the very steps they'd just thrown her from. Because that beggar? He wasn't poor at all. He was the one person in the world who could change everything. And what he did next, well, you have to see it to believe it. The cold hit Sarah's skin like 1,000 needles the moment Victoria slammed the oak door. Thunder cracked overhead, splitting the gray November sky open, and within seconds, the rain came down, in sheets so thick she could barely see the iron gates at the end of the driveway. Her thin cotton dress, the one she'd worn to serve breakfast that morning, clung to her body instantly. Water streamed down her face, mixing with the tears she refused to acknowledge. Behind the beveled glass of the mansion's grand entrance, she could see her stepmother's silhouette, arms crossed, triumphant, watching. Sarah's hands trembled as she looked down at the old man still sitting on the marble steps where she'd found him 20 minutes earlier. He was soaked now, too, his tattered gray coat darkening with rainwater, but he hadn't moved. She'd given him her father's umbrella, the black one with the silver handle that Victoria had been trying to throw away for months, the same umbrella her father had carried to every board meeting for 30 years. The old man held it now, tilted slightly, just enough to keep the rain off the leather briefcase beside him, but not himself. "You shouldn't have done that," the old man said quietly, his voice barely audible over the downpour. His eyes, sharp and clear despite the deep lines around them, met hers with something that looked like recognition. Or maybe pity. Sarah couldn't tell anymore. She'd stopped being able to read people 3 years ago, the day her father died, and left her in Victoria's care. What Sarah didn't know, what no one had told her, because the will was sealed, because the lawyers had been instructed to wait until her 25th birthday, because her father had written specific conditions into a trust so ironclad that even Victoria's team of attorneys couldn't crack it, was that every single thing behind that door belonged to her. The Whitmore estate, the pharmaceutical empire, the offshore accounts, the real estate holdings across 4 continents, all $500 billion of it. Victoria Whitmore, the woman who'd married Sarah's grieving father 18 months before his sudden death, who'd moved into the master bedroom before the funeral flowers had wilted, who'd spent 3 years treating Sarah like an unpaid servant in her own home, controlled absolutely nothing. She never had, but Victoria believed she did. And belief, Sarah had learned, was often more powerful than truth. The mansion door opened again. Amber appeared, Victoria's daughter, 26, and cruel in the way only someone who'd never been denied anything could be. She wore a white silk robe that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. In her manicured hands, she carried a crystal vase. Sarah recognized it immediately. Baccarat, from her mother's collection, one of the few things Victoria hadn't sold off yet. "You're still here?" Amber's voice dripped with theatrical disgust. "Mother said you'd crawl back. They always do." She descended 3 steps, close enough that Sarah could smell her perfume cutting through the rain. Close enough to see, the smile playing at the corners of her lips. Then, with deliberate slowness, Amber tilted the vase. Dirty water, cloudy, brown, thick with what looked like old flower stems and God knows what else, poured out in a viscous stream that hit Sarah's head and shoulders, soaking into her hair, running down her neck in cold, filthy rivulets, that smelled of rot and stagnation. The old man stood up, and something in the way he moved made Amber take a step back. It wasn't threatening. He didn't raise his voice or make any sudden gestures. It was the stillness of it, the deliberation, like watching a judge rise to deliver a verdict. He reached into his coat pocket with weathered fingers and pulled out a white handkerchief, monogrammed with initials Sarah couldn't quite make out through the rain. He handed it to her without a word. She took it reflexively, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it, and pressed it against her face, trying to wipe away the filth that Amber had poured over her. The handkerchief smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. It smelled like her father's study. "Do you know who I am?" the old man asked, but he wasn't looking at Sarah. His gaze was fixed on Amber, who stood frozen on the third step, the empty baccarat vase still dangling from her fingers. The rain had started to soak through her silk robe, and for the first time since Sarah had known her, Amber looked uncertain. "You're a beggar," Amber said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "A homeless man my bleeding heart stepsister felt sorry for, and now you're both trespassing on private property." The old man smiled, and it was the saddest smile Sarah had ever seen. "Private property," he repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. "That's interesting. Very interesting indeed." He bent down, his movements careful despite the rain, and lifted the leather briefcase. It was old but expensive, the kind that lawyers carried in the 80s and 90s, before everything went digital. The brass clasps gleamed even in the gray morning light. He didn't open it. Not yet. He just held it against his chest like it contained something precious. Or dangerous. "My name," he said, speaking clearly now so his voice carried over the rain and up to the doorway where Victoria had appeared behind Amber, "is Henry Castellan. I was your late husband's personal attorney for 32 years, Mrs. Whitmore. I've been trying to reach you for 3 weeks. You've ignored 17 certified letters, 23 phone calls, and 4 requests for an in-person meeting." Sarah felt the world tilt. Henry Castellan. She knew that name. Her father had mentioned him countless times, always with respect, sometimes with something close to reverence. "Henry will make sure you're taken care of," her father had whispered during one of his last hospital visits, his hand weak in hers. "No matter what happens, Henry has instructions. You'll be fine, sweetheart. I promise." That was 3 years ago. Sarah had waited. She'd endured. She'd believed her father's promise, even when Victoria fired all the household staff who'd been kind to her, even when Amber moved into the bedroom that had been Sarah's since childhood, even when they made her eat dinner in the kitchen after everyone else had finished. She'd believed because her father had never broken a promise in his life. But 3 weeks? Henry Castellan had been trying to reach them for 3 weeks, and Victoria had been avoiding him? Victoria's face had gone white, not pale. White, like paper, like bone. "Mr. Castellan," she said, and her voice was different now, careful, calculated. "This is hardly the time or place for—" "Today is November 15th, Henry interrupted, his voice cutting through hers like a blade through silk. "Do you know what that makes today, Mrs. Whitmore?" The silence that followed was broken only by the rain hammering against the stone driveway. Sarah watched Victoria's throat work as she swallowed, watched her glance at Amber, then back at Henry, watched her brain work behind her eyes, calculating, searching for the right response. "It's Sarah's 25th birthday," Henry said quietly, and then he opened the briefcase. Protected from the rain by a waterproof sleeve was a single manila folder. Henry lifted it out with both hands, the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred texts, and even from where Sarah stood, shivering in her soaked dress, she could see the red wax seal pressed into the closure. The Whitmore family crest, a lion and a serpent, intertwined. Her father had used that seal on only the most important documents, the ones that couldn't be undone or contested, the ones that were final. "This," Henry said, holding the folder up so both Victoria and Amber could see it clearly, "is the last will and testament of Jonathan Edward Whitmore, executed on March 3rd, 2022, 17 days before his death. It was sealed by his instruction and witnessed by 3 federal judges. It was to be opened on one specific date and not a moment before." He paused, letting the rain fill the silence. "Today." Victoria descended the steps so fast she nearly slipped on the wet marble. Her silk nightgown clung to her legs, and her perfectly styled hair was beginning to collapse in the rain, but she didn't seem to notice. All her attention was fixed on that folder with an intensity that bordered on feral. "Give me that," she demanded, reaching for it. "I'm his widow. I have a legal right to—" "You have no rights here," Henry said, and his voice, though quiet, carried the weight of 3 decades of legal authority. He didn't pull the folder away or step back. He simply held it steady, and something in his posture made Victoria's hand freeze in midair. "Not to this. Not to anything that follows from this." Sarah watched her stepmother's face cycle through emotions too quickly to name. Confusion, anger, fear, calculation, and then something that looked almost like recognition. Like a gambler who just realized the dice were loaded, the house had always been rigged, and she'd been playing a game she could never win. "The will," Victoria said slowly, her eyes never leaving the folder, "was already read. 3 years ago. I was there." "You were there, Mr. Castellan. Everything was left in trust, managed by the board, with distributions to be made at their discretion. I receive a quarterly allowance as the surviving spouse. Amber receives her stipend. Sarah receives a minimal living expense until she reaches financial maturity, which the board defines as age 30. That was the settlement. That was the agreement." Henry nodded slowly. "That was the public will," he agreed. "The one read at the firm, attended by the board members, filed with the probate court. Standard procedure for an estate of this size. It ensured continuity, prevented stock volatility, kept the pharmaceutical empire stable during the transition." He turned, the folder over in his hands, and Sarah saw there was writing on the back, her father's handwriting, just 2 words. "For Sarah." But Jonathan Whitmore didn't build a $500 billion empire by being predictable, Mrs. Whitmore. He built it by being thorough. The implications of that statement hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she wondered if everyone could hear it over the rain. A second will. Her father had created a second will. The public one had been a decoy, a performance, something to satisfy the board and the shareholders and keep everything running smoothly while the real distribution waited. Waited for today. Waited for her. Amber had gone very still on the steps. "What does that mean?" she asked, and for the first time since Sarah had known her, there was genuine fear in her voice. Not the performative kind she used to get sympathy from her mother, but real fear, the kind that came from standing on the edge of a cliff and realizing the ground beneath you had never been solid at all. Henry broke the wax seal. Henry pulled the document from the folder, and Sarah saw it was thick, at least 40 pages, typed on cream-colored paper with her father's signature on every single page. Not just at the end. Every page. As if he'd wanted to make absolutely certain no one could claim fraud. No one could contest a single word. No one could argue he hadn't understood exactly what he was doing. "I'm going to read the operative clauses," Henry said, his voice steady despite the rain now soaking through his coat. "Mrs. Whitmore, Miss Whitmore, I suggest you listen carefully. What follows has already been set in motion. It became irrevocable the moment Sarah turned 25 at midnight last night." Sarah's breath caught. Midnight. While she'd been lying awake in the servants' quarters, Victoria had moved her to, the small room off the kitchen that had once housed the scullery maid in the 1920s. Her entire life had been changing. The numbers on her phone had clicked from 11:59 to 12, and somewhere, in the infrastructure of banks and law firms and corporate offices, systems had begun to move. Henry cleared his throat and began to read. I, Jonathan Edward Whitmore, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and codicils. To my daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore, on the occasion of her 25th birthday, I leave the entirety of my estate, including, but not limited to, Whitmore Pharmaceutical Industries and all subsidiary companies, all real property, including the family residence known as Whitmore Manor, all financial accounts, investments, trusts, and holdings, all personal property and effects, and complete controlling interest in the Whitmore Family Trust, making her the sole trustee and beneficiary. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rain seemed to quiet, though Sarah knew that was impossible, knew it was just the roaring in her ears as her brain tried to process what she'd just heard. Everything. Her father had left her everything. Not in some distant trust she'd access at 30, not in managed portions doled out by a board. Everything. Now, as of midnight last night. That's not possible, Victoria said, but her voice had gone hollow. The estate was valued at over $500 billion. A transfer of that magnitude would require board approval, shareholder votes, regulatory review. It would take months, years even. You can't just... Henry's phone began to ring. He pulled it from his pocket, glanced at the screen, and answered without preamble. Yes, Judge Morrison. Yes, she's here. Confirmed. He paused, listening. Understood. Proceed with the filings. He ended the call and looked at Victoria. That was Federal Judge Elizabeth Morrison, one of the witnesses to this will. As of 6:47 this morning, approximately 2 minutes ago, the probate court received and approved the emergency filing for immediate estate transfer under the provisions of Jonathan Whitmore's sealed testament. The transfer is legal, binding, and complete. Victoria's phone began to vibrate in the pocket of her robe. Then Amber's phone, somewhere inside the house, started ringing. Then another phone, and another. A cascade of electronic noise that echoed through the mansion's open door. Henry continued reading, his voice never wavering. To my wife, Victoria Whitmore, I leave $1, as required by law to prevent contestation. I make this minimal bequest not from malice, but from certainty. She married me for my money. Let her divorce me for lack of it. He turned a page. To Victoria's daughter, Amber Whitmore, who is not my child and has no legal claim to my estate, I leave nothing. However, I direct my daughter Sarah to allow them both to remain in residence at Whitmore Manor for a period of 30 days following the reading of this will, so they may arrange alternative accommodations. Amber made a sound like a wounded animal. She sat down hard on the steps, her white robe pooling around her, no longer beautiful, just wet and bedraggled. Her phone was in her hand now, the screen lit up with notifications. Sarah could see them even from where she stood. Email after email, text after text, all arriving at once like a digital avalanche. Victoria's hands were shaking as she pulled her own phone out. Her face, illuminated by the screen's glow, went from white to gray. The credit cards, she whispered. They've all been declined. All of them. The account numbers aren't even recognized anymore. She looked up at Henry, then at Sarah, and for the first time really looked at her. Not as an inconvenience, or a servant, or a reminder of the first wife she'd replaced, but as the person who now controlled everything. The penthouse in Manhattan, the villa in Tuscany, the apartment in Paris, those are in the estate? Everything is in the estate, Henry confirmed. The cars, the properties, the art collection, the yacht, the private jet. As of midnight, it all transferred to Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore. The credit cards you've been using were issued against estate accounts. Those accounts are now frozen pending Sarah's review and decision on how to proceed. Sarah stood perfectly still. She didn't speak, didn't move, didn't know what to say or do or feel. 3 years. 3 years of eating alone in the kitchen, of wearing clothes from the charity bin because Victoria said she couldn't afford to buy her new ones, of listening to Amber laugh with her friends about the charity case, living in the servants' quarters. 3 years of believing she had nothing, was nothing, would be nothing, until some distant board decided she was responsible enough to receive a small allowance from her own father's empire. And all of it had been a lie. Not her poverty. That had been real, enforced by Victoria's cruelty. But the power structure, the ownership, the truth. She owned the ground they were standing on. She owned the roof over their heads. She owned the cars in, the garage, the food in the kitchen, the electricity running through the walls. She always had. Victoria's phone rang. She answered it automatically, her movements robotic. "Hello?" A pause. Then her face crumbled. "Yes, this is she." "I don't understand. The lease was paid through the end of the year." "What do you mean the account?" Another pause, longer this time. "But that's my daughter's apartment. She's lived there for 4 years. You can't just..." Her voice broke. 30 days? You're giving us 30 days? Henry tucked the will back into the folder, back into the briefcase, protecting it from the rain that was finally starting to ease. "The property management companies have been notified," he said quietly. "All properties registered to the estate. The 30-day grace period begins today. After that, continued residence will be considered trespassing." Amber was crying now, mascara running down her face in black streaks, her phone clutched against her chest. "Mom, she..." said, her voice small and young and terrified. "Mom, the car lease. They're sending someone to pick it up. Today. They said it was never mine. It was always registered to the estate, and the estate wants it back." Sarah looked at them. These two women who had made her life a calculated misery, who had taken everything her father had built and pretended it was theirs, who had thrown her out into the rain 20 minutes ago for the crime of showing kindness to a stranger. And she felt nothing. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not even anger anymore. Just a vast, echoing emptiness where her emotions should have been. "Sarah," Henry said gently, and she realized he was standing beside her now, holding the umbrella over both of them, her father's umbrella. "What would you like me to do?" "What would you like me to do?" Henry asked again, and Sarah realized he was waiting. They were all waiting. Victoria and Amber on the steps, soaking and destroyed. Henry beside her with the umbrella. Even the rain seemed to pause, the storm holding its breath for her answer. Sarah looked down at her hands. They were still shaking, still cold. The dirty water Amber had poured over her had left a stain on her dress that she knew would never come out, no matter how many times she washed it. Some things, once done, couldn't be undone. "Why did he wait?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible. "My father. Why did he make me wait 3 years? Why didn't he protect me from the beginning?" Henry's expression softened with something that looked like pain. "May I?" He gestured to the will, and Sarah nodded. He opened the folder again, turning past the operative clauses to a section near the end. "He left you a letter. It's part of the legal document. Would you like me to read it?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Henry cleared his throat. "My dearest Sarah, if you're hearing this, then you've survived. I know what I'm asking of you is cruel. I know Victoria will show her true nature the moment I'm gone. I know you'll suffer, and the thought of that suffering has haunted every day since my diagnosis. But I also know something else. Easy money destroys people. Inherited wealth without understanding its weight creates monsters, not stewards. Look at Amber. Look at what Victoria's money did to her daughter. Made her hollow, made her cruel, made her believe people were disposable because she'd never had to earn anything, never had to struggle, never had to see herself clearly in the mirror of consequence. Sarah felt tears mixing with the rain on her face. Her father had known. He'd known exactly what would happen, and he'd let it happen anyway. Henry continued reading. I needed you to understand poverty before you inherited wealth. I needed you to see cruelty, so you'd recognize kindness. I needed you to experience powerlessness, so you'd use power wisely. Most of all, I needed you to become someone who would help a stranger in the rain, even when it cost you everything you thought you had left. That's the test Victoria and Amber failed today. That's the test you passed. The man you helped was Henry, my oldest friend, my most trusted advisor. He would have revealed himself eventually, but you helped him anyway, knowing nothing, expecting nothing. That's who I needed you to become. I'm sorry it hurt. I'm sorry I won't be there to see who you've become. But I'm not sorry for what I've given you. Not just money, but character. Use them both wisely. Love, Dad. The silence that followed was broken by a sound Sarah had never heard before. Victoria, crying. Not delicate tears or performative sobbing, but raw, broken weeping. She sat down on the wet steps beside Amber, her silk robe ruined, her carefully constructed world dissolved, and she cried like a child who'd just learned that actions have consequences. I'll enforce the 30 days, Sarah said finally, her voice steady now. But I want them out of this house today. Henry, can you arrange hotel accommodations? Somewhere modest but clean. I'll cover 2 months while they find employment and housing. She looked at Victoria, really looked at her for the first time. You'll receive nothing from the estate. No settlement, no severance, nothing. But I won't leave you on the street. Not because you deserve my mercy, but because I'm not you. She turned to Amber, who was staring at her with red-rimmed eyes. You're 26. You have a degree from Princeton that my father paid for. Use it. Get a job. Learn what it means to earn something. Sarah paused. And therapy. Both of you. I'll pay for 1 year of sessions. After that, you're on your own. Henry made a note in his phone. It will be arranged within the hour. 30 days later, Sarah stood in her father's study, her study now, and looked at the contracts spread across the mahogany desk. Whitmore Pharmaceutical had 3 new initiatives requiring her approval. A program to provide free medications to low-income families, a research grant for rare diseases that weren't profitable enough for most companies to pursue, and a partnership with an organization that helped formerly incarcerated people find employment. She'd signed them all. The house was different now. She'd rehired the staff Victoria had fired, given them raises, converted the servants' quarters into a proper guest suite. She'd donated Amber's bedroom furniture to charity and turned the space into a library. She'd removed every trace of Victoria from the master bedroom and still couldn't bring herself to sleep there. Some rooms held too many ghosts. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I got the job, marketing assistant. It's entry-level and the pay is terrible and I have 3 roommates. But it's mine. I earned it. I don't know if you'll ever read this or if you even care, but thank you. And I'm sorry. Don't. Sarah stared at the message for a long time. She could block the number, could ignore it, could let Amber disappear into whatever life she built from the rubble. Instead, she typed back, "Congratulations." That took courage. She didn't add, "I forgive you." She didn't know if she did. Maybe forgiveness wasn't the point. Maybe the point was that cruelty could be answered with something other than more cruelty. That power didn't have to corrupt. That mercy and justice weren't always opposites. Or maybe she was just tired. Tired of anger. Tired of pain. tired of carrying the weight of everything her father had left her. Not just the billions, but the test, the suffering, the 3 years of calculated torture that he'd orchestrated from beyond the grave to make her worthy. She walked to the window and looked out at the driveway where Henry had stood in the rain, where Amber had poured dirty water over her head, where everything had changed. The beggar had been a test. The cruelty had been a test. Even her kindness had been a test. She'd passed. But what had she won? An empire she'd never wanted? The satisfaction of watching her tormentors fall? The hollow victory of being right? Sarah touched the glass, her reflection staring back at her. 25 years old, $500 billion, and absolutely alone in a house that had never felt like home. "Was it worth it, Dad?" she whispered to the empty room. The question hung in the air, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. Because that was the truth, no one told you about inheritance. You didn't just receive money, or power, or property. You received the choices of everyone who came before you, the consequences of their decisions, the weight of their love and their cruelty and their impossible tests. And then you had to decide what to do with it all.